The Monarch Legacy of Monsters series was titanically disappointing and a major missed opportunity for the Monsterverse. As it stands, the current four movies are Godzilla 2014, Godzilla King of the Monsters, Kong Skull Island, and Godzilla vs. Kong. And all of those movies have pretty much given us nothing as far as interesting humans or the world building at large. The Monarch series covers from 1952 to 2017 over the course of 10 episodes and focuses largely on the humans and world building. And unfortunately, it was a massive disappointment, and they horribly misused their time and butchered the story. The writers insisted on doing a past and present timeline that each had multiple timelines of their own to try to make the really simplistic story they told seem convoluted and more interesting. The past timeline was decent overall, but they really squandered anything that could have been interesting, and the present timeline felt like they picked up someone's rejected script out of the trash and threw a couple titans into it because it was a borderline soap opera that really didn't make much sense and was pretty inconsequential except for the last two episodes. I'm going to give a quick chronological synopsis since I covered each episode in detail, and I really want to talk about all the things that frustrated me and what they could have done that would have been much more interesting than what we actually got. In 1952, Lee Shaw meets Dr. Keiko Mira to go investigate weird gamma radiation. They run into Bill Randa, and this is where they see their first Titan. This giant bat thing that the commenters have been nice enough to inform me is called the Ion Dragon. In 1954, Keiko, Lee, and Bill get the US Army to give them an atomic bomb to lure Godzilla, and the Army tries to kill it. This is what gets them funding from Monarch, which General Puckett and a bunch of soldiers witnessed in person, but for some reason the rest of their time in the past timeline is spent trying to find more evidence than the giant lizard that we saw, Godzilla, and battling for funding from Monarch to do their research. At this point, it's Project Monarch. As we progress into the late 1950s, we find out that Keiko has a kid, Hiroshi Randa, and then she dies in 1959, as far as Lee and Bill are aware. In 1962, Lee and a few of his comrades try to go through a Titan portal and end up in between the Hollow Earth and our Earth in a place that gets later called the Axis Mundi. He's there for a week and his entire team dies, and when he wakes up, it's 1982. This is when Monarch places him in a nursing home and keeps him drugged up until our present day timeline. In 1973, when the movie Skull Island takes place, we see Bill Randa, who the years have apparently been hard on, who believes that Lee and Keiko are both dead, and he aggressively pursues his research and throws a bunch of tapes into the ocean that get discovered later on. Obviously, he dies in the Skull Island movie. G-Day, or Godzilla Day, is based on the Godzilla 2014 movie, and the present timeline is in 2015, with a little bit of bouncing around a couple years here and there for backstory stuff. The present timeline is pretty much a mess of a wild goose chase, with the four main characters, Kate Randa, her half-brother Kentaro Randa, Kentaro's ex-girlfriend May, and Lee Shaw, who is now old and played by Kurt Russell. Kate is told that her dad's plane went down in Alaska and he's dead. She goes to Tokyo to get his things, and this is where she finds out about his second family and Kentaro. At this point, they find Hiroshi's files, and Monarch tries to kidnap Kate to get the files. They go break out Lee Shaw from a Monarch nursing home and make their way to Alaska to look for his last known location. The majority of the time in the present day timeline is taken up by drama between the main three characters who are young, Kate, Kentaro, and May, and Monarch just repeatedly being absolutely retarded, and somehow this shadow organization that's been around for 60 years can't function without relying on these three kids who know nothing. Really, the only thing of substance we get is the very end of the season where we see that Apex has Kong in their facility, and obviously we see him in a few years in Godzilla vs. Kong. For this video, I'm going to list off my frustrations and then give examples of what I think could have been done better. My issues are the repetition of the plot, the unlikable characters in the present timeline, terrible setups, which ruined what could have actually been good payoffs, and characters being really black and white throughout the first 75% of the season. And then the last one is the multiple timelines that didn't really serve a purpose or contribute to the story in any way. They just tried to make it a bit more confusing so that it seemed deeper. One last thing that I'm going to mention here that I'm not going to go into in the video is that there were definitely things that happened that I felt were culture war motivated that were really annoying and would just really take you out of the show randomly. I go through that and give examples and explanations in my single episode videos if you do want to check that out. But I don't like the culture war shit, so I'm not going to repeat that all here. My first frustration is the repetition of the plot in both timelines because it leads to so much wasted time. The show really could have been like 4 or 5 episodes for what we got. The present day timeline, and I feel like this is pretty obvious, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. The entire premise is they want to find Kate and Kentaro's dad, Hiroshi, and they just go from place to place using ass pulls, like this Indiana Jones style map that he set up in his office to figure out the next place to chase him to, all over the world. That's pretty much the plot for them from the second episode until episode 9. And the filler is just awful drama and this weird love triangle where it looks like Kentaro is going to have Mei, who's his ex girlfriend, stolen by his half sister. And there's also the fact that they get stuck repeatedly and captured by Monarch repeatedly. And Monarch's like, oh, okay, we'll trust you, and then gives them resources over and over. Even though these kids really have nothing to offer outside of being related to Hiroshi. It's a really stupid dynamic, and they do it multiple times. In the past timeline, it's definitely better. In episode 1, we get a flash forward to 1959 where Keiko quote unquote dies. Then the rest of the story, we see them looking for Titans and working on their theory. They find one, they're on the verge of losing their funding for the project, and they get it at the last minute. And this is pretty repetitive, and I'll be honest, it's also pretty fucking retarded. After the general of the military and a bunch of soldiers see Godzilla, how would funding ever get pulled from this project? And certainly not within 5 years. The government funds all kinds of wild shit, especially during the Cold War era post World War II. When they have hard evidence of something, which they have video of Godzilla and a bunch of eyewitnesses, they would fund this project probably forever, but at least for decades. Either way, the plots don't really have much more to them than this kind of stuff throughout the season, where it's just one recurring problem over and over. My second frustration is the incredibly unlikable present timeline cast, who gets like 75% of the screen time. They're a nightmare, and they make the entire show feel like a slog. The past timeline isn't bad as far as the people, Keiko, Lee, and Bill, except for this weird one-off episode where Lee and Keiko were kind of a thing, and the show is just inexplicably like, nah, I'm good. They brought up the plot point for one episode and then just get rid of it. It doesn't really make them bad as much as it was just weird, so I wanted to mention it. But the real issue lies with the present timeline. Kate, Mei, Kentaro, Hiroshi, and Tim, who eventually becomes one of the protagonists, are just miserable characters to watch. Kate hates her dad and whines the whole first part of the season, and then suddenly flips to wanting to find him desperately. We also find out that she's a liar and a cheater, and this doesn't really serve a purpose other than to show that she's a lesbian, I guess, and it just kind of makes her a worse person. They don't put her in a relationship later where she has like the opportunity to cheat and then doesn't do it or something. So it really just makes her an asshole. Mei is just a nightmare. She's a bitch the entire time, and we find out later that she's also a liar, and she abandoned her family because she deleted a bunch of research from a corporation and thinks that she was morally righteous to do so. And she just treats Kentaro like shit the entire time. She's kind of whiny the entire time. She acts like a dick to service people at different points in the show. She doesn't really serve a purpose other than to be kind of a MacGuffin to just find shit on the computer when they need to move the plot forward to their next location. Awful. Everything with her on screen is just awful. Kentaro is treated like a pussy and is just dragged along by Kate and Mei for the first half of the season until they see their dad in episode 6, where he just completely flips and then whines and pouts and wants to go home. And then we also get a random flashback of him in one of the episodes where he no-showed to his first art exhibit, which is a financial opportunity for him and his first one, to go hook up with Mei. Complete dick move to his parents, who helped set him up in the first place. And then when he's finally reunited with his dad, he treats him like total shit and actually rubs it in his dad's face that Kate is dead, which they believe at that point in the story. So he's either being a giant bitch or just a complete jackass. He has no in between, and I started calling him Kentaro Ren in my episodic videos near the end because he's just whatever the plot needs to be. If he needs to be a bitch and passive, he is. If he needs to be angry and throwing a tantrum, he is. It's not clear what he wants. His emotions and everything are just all over the place, completely out of control. Another just terrible character. Hiroshi Randa, in the minimal screen time that he gets, is pretty much a total cunt. He had 2 secret families, sees Lee in 1982, and is the one to institutionalize him in the Monarch facility, calls his whole family crazy. He was an absent father by all accounts, and we don't really know much about him. He's sad when he thinks that Kate is dead, but Kentaro tells him to get fucked. So he's just an asshole. Even when he's not on screen for the entire season, he's being talked about like he's an asshole. And then when he's on screen, he continues to be an asshole. Again, another unlikable character. Tim is a weird one for me. Mainly, I just think he's poorly written more than unlikable. They wanted the payoff of him leaving Monarch to join Apex and our main group at the end, but the first episode, he accosts Kate at a train station and then kidnaps her. I'm not going to say that this arc couldn't have worked, but they put pretty much no effort into making it work. He has a couple conversations with Verduga, who's his boss, where he's like, we should just be nice to him, maybe they'll help us. And then eventually he just flips, but not for a specific reason. He starts off as a creeper slash kidnapper, and then is just kind of the awkward bitch getting bossed around the whole show. He could have been interesting, but overall was just pretty cringe, and his character doesn't really make much sense, which I guess you can see the theme at this point. My third frustration is that they had some nice little character moments spattered throughout the season, and payoffs that could have been excellent if episodes 2 to 8 weren't just straight trash. The most obvious one of these bad setups for me is the treatment that General Puckett gets throughout the season. General Puckett is framed the entire season as villainous. He just wants to kill the monsters. He doesn't care beyond that. He's short-sighted. It's also implied that he's very politically motivated because of the way that he treats Lee. In episode 9, when he's talking to Bill, they actually have a really good conversation about how hard it is to lose Lee, and they're kind of bonding. This scene would have paid off a lot better if he hadn't been framed as a total asshole all season and demoted Lee for not playing politics. Another example is that everything with Hiroshi has no weight to it by the time we get to it. He has almost no screen time, and he's just talked about like a dick the entire time. If we had spent some time with him growing up, then when Lee comes back in 1982, this could have been a really powerful reunion scene, instead of just a throwaway where he just calls him crazy and locks him up. When he's reunited with Keiko and Kate, again, the scene doesn't mean much because we haven't really gotten anything from their relationship. Maybe if they had shortened the timeline a bit, and Hiroshi had been a little bit older when he lost his mom and Lee, we could have seen his struggle losing his mom and growing up without any parental figures. You had Bill kind of unraveling. Again, this could have been a really moving scene instead of this just like, oh, I guess this douchebag is meeting his mom, who I don't really know anything about. Who gives a shit? Another opportunity that they kind of whiffed on and didn't commit to was that they really half-assed Lee in the past and made him pretty altruistic, and he was always on Keiko and Bill's side the entire time. They could have made him way more interesting and much more politically motivated and super ambitious, particularly early on, to the point where maybe he actually abandons them when they need him. This would give you a nice low point for him and the story, and then later on when it really matters, he comes through and chooses Keiko and Bill over his own aspirations. Instead, this gets hinted at in one episode that he needs to play politics a little bit by Puckett, and his immediate reaction is to be like, get fucked, lol. And he just kind of half-ass plays politics the whole time, but he's never framed as bad for it or even really morally gray. He's just the good guy throughout. Again, just Titan-sized missed opportunity there for a really interesting arc for Lee. Another obvious one is the transition from Apex to Monarch at the end of the season. If May had been used properly, or if they had gone a different route entirely, we could have seen Apex rise into the research and tech world, and instead we get one shit episode with May working there, and then when we jump ahead 2 years in time, Apex is established. I could come up with more examples of this, but these are pretty big ones, and this is just rampant throughout the show, where these payoffs just fall really flat because the setup was so bad throughout. My fourth frustration is that a huge part of the waste in setups is because the show wanted to paint everyone as right or wrong, black and white, and that's it, only to try to make that person a little bit more gray and reasonable later on at the end of the story. The most obvious example is Puckett's whole thing with Keiko and Lee about Godzilla. The argument being made is that he wants to try to kill it and she wants to study it. The show frames this as he's stupid, he's the villain, he doesn't understand, he's short-sighted, nature is beautiful, blah, blah, blah. This could have been a really interesting conversation about risk and rewards, and he should be talking about how it's his job to protect people, and they don't even know what they're dealing with. And she should be trying to explain that if they can safely capture it or study it, it could be a massive breakthrough for science and humanity, because it's an unknown organism that's huge. Puckett should probably concede this point while also pointing out that the fact that it's an unknown means it's just as likely to destroy humanity as it is to push it forward. The fact that Godzilla is trying to eat an atomic bomb would be his evidence of that. And there's so much that can be done with this, but the conversation kind of devolves into Lee talking to Puckett and Keiko bitching on the sideline. And the perspective the show wants you to take is that nature's good and you're bad because you're a butthole. And it doesn't really go any deeper than that. Just a total whiff of something that could have been really interesting there. The treatment of Apex in this show was terrible and kind of incoherent. The one Apex heavy episode that we get, they're just framed as an evil corporation hurting animals, and May is the hero for deleting presumably years and millions of dollars worth of research that they did on these animals. The logistics of how she got access to this and could do it in her cubicle, and it wasn't in some super duper top secret hidden server that you needed special access to get to, aside. How much more interesting would it have been if she found the files and wanted to delete them, but didn't because the animals had already been sacrificed and they had learned from it, and she didn't want it to be in vain, but also didn't want it to continue, so she confronted her boss. Also, again, her boss is framed as super evil. They have a line in there about helping amputees and stuff, but the implications are kind of that this is a shield for the company to do nefarious shit, which is what they actually want to do. And that they're bad because they want a Titan brain, and they're willing to kidnap May, and all this stuff makes them look really bad. Instead of Apex getting some kind of development and build-up, at the very end of the season, we get 30 seconds, and Kentaro says, "Oh, shit's changed. Everything's just A-okay now." And then they just move on. Another massively missed opportunity when you consider what they actually spent time on, which was like May and Kentaro bickering and stuff. I've mentioned Hiroshi multiple times because a lot of the story focuses around him, but he's just framed as such a sack of shit all season, to the point where you're supposed to agree with Kentaro rubbing it in his face that his daughter died and blaming him for it. It would have been nice if he had actually given an explanation for the two families, for being an absentee dad, why he ran away when Godzilla showed up, or if he had been conflicted about what to do with Lee, and then Monarch was the one who locked him up. Instead, Hiroshi called him crazy and was like, "Go fuck yourself in the nursing home with drugs." And it's just this shit all season where it's like, did we need a backstory of Kate cheating on her girlfriend? It seems that the time would have been spent better seeing what Hiroshi was doing for all this time. Maybe he was an absentee dad because he was trying to save the world. Maybe he was still loyal to his family because they all died for this thing they believed in, instead of shitting all over their graves and bitching to Lee about it. We didn't see any of this. We literally saw him as a kid, the main characters bitch about him all season, and we see him at the end. We're given nothing with his character, who a majority of the story focuses around. It's wild. And my last frustration is that the multiple timelines didn't really serve a purpose beyond trying to make the story seem deeper than it was. I actually think a linear story would have been much more interesting and would have given the twist and reappearance of characters some real weight. The multiple timelines in this story didn't really do anything useful. Multiple timelines work if you have a time travel show in a conventional sense, or a show like Dark, where you have multiple timelines running parallel, but they're all tied together. And then when you get the reveals, you're like, oh shit, this show doesn't really have any of those moments. Outside of a couple small things, they didn't even do the thing where the past timeline is talking about something, then we directly see how it impacts the present timeline. Very little of that. Not to mention the flashbacks of the present timeline are just a colossal waste of time and pretty much meaningless filler that makes me actually dislike the present timeline characters more. If the show progressed in a linear fashion, we could have gotten Keiko's death after her full arc, and you might actually think she's dead, instead of it being fairly obvious that she was going to come back. They use Lee's time skip of 20 years, but don't really do much with it except make Hiroshi an asshole, and Bill just dies in between the time skips. If it had been linear, we could have filled in the gap with Bill and Hiroshi growing up together and really gotten into Bill kind of unraveling and going crazy and obsessed. We could have seen Hiroshi's character as a kid, and then when Lee comes back, would have been like a real oh shit moment. Then we could see how Hiroshi is with his families, and when he quote unquote dies, then Kate and Kentaro take over the story, and we get another oh shit moment when Lee shows up again. And on top of this, Keiko coming back might have actually been surprising. If she had disappeared in like episode 2 or 3 and then come back near the finale, it would have been crazy. It really seems like they did the multiple timelines just to get some action scenes in each episode, and particularly episode 1 to get the hook, and make the story seem more interesting, because the present day timeline is really a slog to get through with just boring drama and assholes you don't like. I don't want to go too long, and I've already covered all the episodes in detail, so this is more just big picture stuff. But this is my perspective on the full season now that we know everything. And overall, it's just really disappointing that out of 7-ish hours of TV, we got maybe an hour and a half of a decent show with some good moments. I hope that if we do get a season 2, which seems likely to me based on the ratings, that we see some improvement in the writing, and they really cut down on the wasted time. And even better would be if they just got rid of Kate, Kentaro, and May totally, but that's probably being too optimistic. As always, comment, let me know what you think. I'll try to respond, as long as you're not just insulting me. Like and subscribe and shit. Thanks. See ya.